We would like to send out a special thanks to the fun, binge-worthy puzzle game Best Fiends for supporting our podcast. Ready to give your brain some TLC? Download Best Fiends free today on the App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Enjoy the show. February 14th, 1985. Colorado Springs, Colorado. The bodies of 37-year-old Cassandra Rundle and her two children, 12-year-old Detrick Sturm and 10-year-old Melanie Sturm, are discovered inside their respective bedrooms at the residence. The two females were sexually assaulted and beaten, and all three victims have been strangled to death. Since Cassandra had placed some personal ads in a local newspaper and received responses from a number of men, there is speculation that this might be connected to the crime. Years later, a man serving time on death row for killing another family is looked at as a possible suspect, but there is no evidence to implicate him, and the murders of Cassandra, Detrick, and Melanie remain unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and on this episode, we're going to be exploring an horrific crime involving the deaths of a mother and her two children, the 1985 murders of Cassandra Rundle, Detrick Sturm, and Melanie Sturm. This is a case which was requested to me last year by a listener named JB, and since this crime took place on February the 14th, and Valentine's Day is just around the corner, I thought now would be a good time to cover it. At the time she was murdered, Cassandra Rundle was a single mother raising her two preteen children, Detrick and Melanie, before they were all murdered inside their residence in Colorado Springs. At the outset, investigators had a large pool of potential suspects to work with, as Cassandra had a boyfriend, two ex-husbands, and had received responses from no less than 85 men after placing some personal ads in a newspaper the previous summer. For that reason, the crime would become known as the Lonely Hearts Murders. However, none of these leads went anywhere, though another promising suspect would emerge when a former Army soldier named Philip Wilkinson was sent to death row for the murders of a mother and her two children in North Carolina years later. There were a number of compelling similarities between these two crimes, and Wilkinson had apparently been assigned to a nearby Army post in Colorado at the time Cassandra, Detrick, and Melanie were killed. Unfortunately, nothing has conclusively linked Wilkinson to this crime, even though there seems to be ample forensic evidence available which could possibly lead to a potential suspect. It should also be mentioned that in early 2020, this case was the subject of a 6-episode season of Colorado Cold Case, a true crime podcast presented by the Colorado Springs Gazette newspaper. The Colorado Springs Police Department declined to participate in that podcast, so there are a lot of unanswered questions about the current status of the investigation. Regardless, on this particular episode, we're going to explore what is probably one of the most brutal, senseless, and puzzling crimes ever featured on The Trail Went Cold. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved murders of Cassandra Rundle, Detrick Sturm, and Melanie Sturm. Our story begins in Colorado Springs, Colorado in 1985. Our central figure is 37-year-old Cassandra Rundle, a single mother who lives in a rental home on Laclede Street in the Ivywild subdivision with her 2 children, 12-year-old Detrick Sturm and 10-year-old Melanie Sturm. Cassandra originally hails from Morgantown, West Virginia, where she married her high school sweetheart Steve Sturm shortly after graduation. The couple soon moved to Pueblo, Colorado and had 2 children together before they divorced in 1974. After Steve moved to Ohio, Cassandra retained custody of Detrick and Melanie and would attend the University of Southern Colorado, graduating with a bachelor's degree in behavioral science. While there, she got involved in a relationship with Douglas Peltzer, a fellow student who also happened to be her career advisor. Douglas would marry Cassandra in 1977 and live with her and her 2 children until they got divorced 6 years later. At this particular point, Cassandra works as an executive assistant at the Gates Land Company and is enrolled in a pre-law course in preparation for attending law school, and she also does advocacy work for the Rape Coalition of Colorado Springs. Detrick and Melanie are both known for being kind, bright children and are enrolled in gifted programs at their respective schools. In spite of their divorce, Cassandra and Douglas have continued to remain very good friends, and since he lives only a few miles from their residence, he continues to be a part of the family's life. In fact, on February the 12th, Douglas took Cassandra and the 2 children out to see the newly released Harrison Ford movie Witness, and the following day, he took Cassandra out to dinner. Later that night, Douglas phoned Cassandra at her residence and got the impression that she had a visitor, but after their call ended, this would turn out to be the last time she was confirmed to be alive. At around 10:30 a.m. the following morning, which happened to be Valentine's Day, Douglas showed up at the house to deliver some Valentine's gifts, which included a record album he had purchased for Cassandra. Douglas was surprised to see that the shades were still down, and after receiving no answer to his knocks at the front door, he decided to let himself inside. Douglas would soon be horrified to discover that the entire family was murdered, so he ran to a neighbor's residence in order to phone the police. Cassandra's nude body was lying face down on her bed, as her hands and feet had been tied with extension cord, as well as electrical cord cut from a table lamp. She had been raped and beaten several times with a blunt instrument before she was strangled to death with a ligature. Melanie's partially clothed body was found face down on the floor of her own bedroom, and like her mother, her hands and feet had been bound with a cord before she was raped, beaten with a blunt instrument, and fatally strangled with a ligature. In fact, Melanie was beaten so badly that she had a fractured skull, and since her wrists were bloodied, she had made a desperate attempt to escape from her bonds. There was also overturned furniture in the bedroom, which indicated that Melanie had gotten into a violent struggle with her attacker prior to her death. Detrick was found strangled to death on the floor of his own bedroom, and a bloody hockey stick was next to his body. Since traces of the victim's blood were on the stick, this meant it was the blunt instrument which had been used to beat them. Even though his sister was partially clad in her nightclothes, Detrick was wearing street clothes, which suggested that he might have gone outside at some point and returned while the murders of his mother and sister were taking place. Indeed, a neighbor would report that she thought she saw Detrick outside the front of his house at around 7 a.m. before he walked back inside. Since the beds were all made, it appeared that the family had woken up before the crime took place, likely sometime between 7 o'clock and 11 o'clock. The Colorado Springs Police Department did everything they could to meticulously preserve evidence from the murder scene and called in the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for assistance. The Rundle family would elect to have the bodies of Cassandra, Detrick, and Melanie cremated before the remains were interred in a burial vault at East Oak Grove Cemetery in Morgantown. Cassandra's father, Richard Rundle, happened to be a former prosecutor, and he would offer a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Neither Douglas Peltzer nor Cassandra's first husband, Steve Sturm, were considered to be suspects in the murders, though there would be a legal battle when Douglas attempted to collect on a $28,000 double indemnity insurance policy. While Cassandra had named Douglas as her beneficiary when they originally got married, she neglected to take him off the policy after the divorce, so the Rundle family took him to court to prevent him from collecting the money, and Douglas decided to withdraw his claim. Cassandra also had a boyfriend at the time of her death, but his name has never been released publicly, and not much information is known about him, aside from the fact that he was a co-worker of hers. In fact, about an hour and a half after the bodies were discovered, the boyfriend actually stopped by the residence because Cassandra had not shown up for work that morning, only for him to learn that the entire family had been murdered. But much like her ex-husbands, I see no indication that the boyfriend was ever considered to be a suspect. However, the police would soon learn that they had a potentially large pool of suspects to investigate. In July of 1984, 7 months before the crime took place, Cassandra had placed a personal ad in the newspaper, the Colorado Springs Sun, which read, quote, "Blonde, green eyes, 5 feet 2 inches, 95 pounds, seeking a rugged individualist. I'm a free spirit, independent, well-educated, somewhat shy, sensitive, and enjoy life. Am a one-man woman looking for one good man. Please send photo and a short letter." End quote. 1 month later, she placed a second ad in the paper, and it read, quote, "Warm, together, bright, beautiful, and modest lady, seeking friendship with a gentle man of quality and character, 30 to 40 years old." End quote. The whole personal ads angle would prompt some media outlets to refer to the crime as the Lonely Hearts Murders. Douglas told Cassandra that he was uncomfortable about her placing these ads because he thought it had the potential to be dangerous, but as a naturally shy person, she thought it was her best opportunity to meet other men. In total, Cassandra received about 85 responses to the 2 ads, and she wound up going on lunch dates with at least a dozen of the men who responded. Since there were no signs of forced entry at the residence, and Douglas believed Cassandra had a visitor during their final phone call, it was theorized that Cassandra might have invited a man into her home that night who wound up killing her and her children. Police did whatever they could to track down and investigate each of the men who responded to the ad, but were unable to identify all of them in order to eliminate them as suspects. In total, they interviewed over 400 people, and 1 year following the murders, they announced that they had narrowed down their potential list of suspects to 6, all of whom were individuals who personally knew the victims. At one point, a grand jury was convened to determine if there was enough evidence to charge anyone with the crime, but no charges were ever filed. The case would take an interesting turn during the early morning hours of January the 9th, 1992, when a 24-year-old former Army soldier named Philip Edward Wilkinson walked into a police station in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Wilkinson was accompanied by a pastor and said that his conscience was bothering him, so he wanted to make a confession to an horrific crime. Indeed, just over 5 months earlier, on July the 29th, 1991, 38-year-old Judy Hudson and her 2 children, 19-year-old Crystal and 11-year-old Larry Jr., had been brutally murdered inside their Fayetteville apartment, and Wilkinson told police that he was responsible for their deaths. According to Wilkinson, he had noticed Crystal sleeping on the couch through the apartment's sliding glass doors, and after grabbing a bowling pin from the yard, he decided to break inside. Wilkinson started caressing Crystal, but when she woke up, he proceeded to sexually assault her before savagely beating her on the head with the bowling pin until she was dead. Wilkinson then walked into her mother Judy's bedroom, where she was also sexually assaulted and bludgeoned with the bowling pin. Afterward, he entered the bedroom where Larry Jr. was sleeping and fatally beat him as well. At the time these murders took place, Wilkinson had been a private first class stationed at Fort Bragg, but he suddenly went AWOL and disappeared the very next day until he felt compelled to turn himself in months later. Following his confession, Wilkinson was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree burglary, 1 count of attempted first-degree rape, 4 counts of first-degree sexual offense, and 2 counts of felonious larceny. 2.5 years later, Wilkinson agreed to plead guilty to all these charges and received a capital sentencing hearing where the jury recommended that he be sentenced to death via the gas chamber. On April 3, 1997, less than 24 hours before his execution was scheduled to take place, Wilkinson was taken off death row after guards found 2 suicide notes in his cell in which he wrote that he was planning to kill himself before the state did. As a result, Wilkinson was granted a stay of execution so that state psychiatrists could determine whether or not he was mentally incompetent. It was ultimately determined that Wilkinson was legally competent enough to be executed, but he responded by filing numerous appeals against his death sentence. While all of these appeals were denied, the state of North Carolina has since placed a moratorium on executions, so Wilkinson is still incarcerated on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh. Well, needless to say, due to the numerous similarities between the Hudson family murders and the deaths of Cassandra, Detrick, and Melanie, there was a lot of speculation that Wilkinson could have been responsible for both crimes. In fact, during his original confession to the Hudson murders, Wilkinson mentioned that he had been peeking into people's windows for years And this habit originally started in early 1985 while he was stationed at Fort Carson, an Army post which happened to be located just over 8 miles south of Colorado Springs. Once he learned about the Hudson murders, Cassandra's father, Richard Rundle, became so convinced of Wilkinson's involvement that he actually traveled to North Carolina to attend his capital sentencing hearing in 1994. Richard has since passed away, but he always expressed his belief that the Colorado Springs PD did not pursue Wilkinson hard enough as a suspect. It's been reported that Wilkinson was initially ruled out because investigators believed he was in South Korea at the time the murders occurred. However, in the aforementioned Colorado Cold Case podcast, they checked Wilkinson's military records and saw he had been assigned to Fort Carson in early February of 1985, so he may have already arrived in the area a short time before the crime took place. Regardless, Wilkinson has never admitted any involvement, and no conclusive evidence has linked him to the murders. In a 2012 article in the Colorado Springs Gazette, retired Colorado Springs Police Sergeant Dick Reisler, who was the lead detective on this case, said that there was always one person he strongly suspected, but he would not name him. He stated, quote, "If I were on the jury with the suspect in my mind, I wouldn't convict him either, and I know more than the jury will ever know." End quote. At one point, DNA evidence which had been collected from the crime scene was entered into a national database, but as far as I can tell, no matches were ever made. So after 37 years, there are still no conclusive answers about who was actually responsible for the murders of Cassandra Rundle, Detrick Sturm, and Melanie Sturm. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a few moments to offer some love to our sponsor, Best Fiends. So like I mentioned in the intro to this episode, we are currently in the month of February and only a few days shy of Valentine's Day. Love is in the air, and while romance is great, it's really important to give your brain some love too. And I can tell you that Best Fiends is my favorite way to treat my brain to a much-needed recharge. It's like a mental spa day you can enjoy wherever you go. I always like to quote that great philosopher Forrest Gump. Best Fiends is like a box of chocolates. You never know which puzzle you're gonna get. Okay, I've never actually said that before now, but I am saying it here because Best Fiends never disappoints. Even in the shortest month, you deserve the maximum amount of me time. Best Fiends is a mobile puzzle game that anyone can download and play, and you don't really know which puzzle you're gonna get because there are thousands of fun ones to solve and a bunch of cute characters too. And with new characters and puzzles being added all the time, you can literally play through thousands of levels and never get bored. Last month, I shared my New Year's resolution of making it to level 3000 by the end of January, and I'm pleased to announce that I achieved that goal. Playing Best Fiends for over 2 years now has been a great way to de-stress between recording sessions, and you get a nice rush of adrenaline whenever you beat these levels. Ready to give your brain some TLC? Download Best Fiends free today on the App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. So as I'm sure you know, a lot of older cold cases have been solved within the past few years, thanks in large part to DNA profiling and genetic genealogy. But I've noticed that one of the top states at accomplishing this seems to be Colorado, as they've had a particularly large amount of arrests take place for unsolved crimes, many of which were decades old. For example, last year we saw arrests in prominent Colorado cases which were featured on both Unsolved Mysteries and The Trail Went Cold. The 1982 murders of Bobby Oberholzer and Annette Schnee, aka the Orange Sock murders, and the 1985 murder of Roger Dean. Another prominent and particularly brutal crime from Colorado during this time period, which has also recently been solved, is the Aurora Hammer murders, which occurred on January the 16th, 1984, and involved an intruder walking into a residence and using a hammer to fatally bludgeon a man named Bruce Bennett, as well as his wife Deborah and their 7-year-old daughter Melissa, who were both sexually assaulted as well. While 34 years later, DNA evidence linked the crime to a suspect named Alexander Christopher Ewing, who was serving time in a Nevada prison. I'm sure you've noticed some similarities between the Aurora Hammer murders and today's featured case, but Ewing could not have been responsible for these murders since he was taken into police custody for another crime during the summer of 1984 and has been incarcerated ever since. But these three examples are far from the only cold cases in Colorado which have had a resolution in recent years, so you have to believe it's only a matter of time before DNA leads to the individual who murdered Cassandra Rundle, Detrick Sturm, and Melanie Sturm. Obviously, back in 1985, DNA profiling had not yet become such an important element of criminal investigations, but the Colorado Springs Police Department did say they made sure to do a very meticulous job at collecting and preserving the evidence. We do know they have DNA evidence because it was entered into a national database at some point, which I'm assuming contained the DNA for incarcerated offenders, but they failed to make a match. However, the big advancements in forensic genealogy have allowed investigators in a number of cold cases, including the Orange Sock murders and the Roger Dean murder, to link DNA evidence to an individual who had never even popped up on the radar as a suspect. Like I mentioned in the intro, the Colorado Springs PD has been pretty tight-lipped about this investigation, and citing their busy schedule, they declined to participate in the season of the Colorado Cold Case podcast, which profiled these murders. The police did allow the makers of the podcast to submit some written questions about the case, but they were not answered, so it's unclear if investigators have already gone the genetic genealogy route, or if one particular individual has been ruled out as a suspect. A number of prominent, high-profile homicide detectives have worked on this case, including Lou Smith, who was called in years after the fact in order to provide some assistance, and is probably best known for coming out of retirement to assist with the investigation into the John Benet Ramsey murder. And if you look at the earliest media coverage of this case, it's dominated by none other than Joe Kenda, who would later find fame by being host of the Investigation Discovery true crime show Homicide Hunter. In fact, 2 days after the murders, Kenda was quoted as saying, "I believe this case will be solved, and relatively soon." But even though he worked nearly 400 homicide cases throughout his career, and was renowned for having a closure rate of 92%, this was one of the crimes which got away from him. I'm sure one of the reasons for Kenda's optimism was because this case had no shortage of potential suspects, as Cassandra Rundle had 2 ex-husbands, a boyfriend, no less than 85 men who answered her personal ads, and we also have a suspect currently sitting on death row for the strikingly similar murders of another family. We'll talk more about Philip Wilkinson later on, but I find it interesting that as an incarcerated death row inmate, you would assume that his DNA would be on file, yet I've never heard clarification about whether or not it has been compared with the DNA evidence from this crime. But since there were no signs of forced entry at the house, I know investigators were inclined to believe the killer was someone that the family, or at the very least Cassandra, knew. At one point, police said they had narrowed down their list of potential suspects to 6, but while they were never publicly named, it was mentioned that they were all individuals who were known to the victims. No matter which way you slice it, this is a puzzling crime, and if the perpetrator wasn't just some random predator who decided to break into the house, you have to wonder what could have driven this person to not only murder Cassandra, but her 2 children as well. Of course, this story provides an interesting time capsule of the world before we had the internet and online dating, as people would place personal ads in the newspaper in order to meet potential spouses. Back then, anyone who was interested in responding to Cassandra's ad would have to write a letter directly to the paper, who would subsequently deliver them to her, and she would respond in kind. Since there was no digital trail like there would be today, it sounds like investigators were unable to identify all 85 of the men who responded to Cassandra's ads. The idea of one of these men being the killer is a pretty intriguing one, but it seems like as the years have gone on, investigators have pretty much discounted the personal ads connection. Out of all the responses Cassandra received, she went out on lunch dates with about a dozen of these men, but it appears that none of the individuals who were tracked down and interviewed by police raised any major red flags. Remember, Cassandra originally placed those ads in the summer of 1984, 5 to 6 months before these murders took place, and while details are vague, it has been reported that Cassandra did have a boyfriend at the time she was killed. Even though investigators stated that they did not consider this boyfriend to be a suspect, there is very little information out there about him, and his name was never released publicly. All we really know is that he was a co-worker of hers and showed up at the residence looking for Cassandra a couple of hours after the bodies were found. It's never been revealed how long Cassandra and this guy were dating or how serious their relationship was, but if things were going well between them, she may not have even been bothering to pay attention to any responses she might have received from her personal ads. Indeed, if it had been a couple of months or so since Cassandra made contact with any of the men who answered the ads, then it's less likely that this angle has any connection to the murders. In regards to Cassandra's two ex-husbands, we know that her first husband, Steve Sturm, was living in Ohio at the time, so I can only assume his whereabouts were accounted for and he could be easily ruled out as a suspect. But the situation between Cassandra and her second ex-husband, Douglas Meltzer, was a bit more unusual because even though they had been divorced for nearly 2 years, he was still a major part of her life. And while Douglas was not the biological father of Detrick and Melanie, he had lived with them for around 6 years, so it sounds like he remained a father figure for them as he took them to the movies only 2 days before the murders. Cassandra's friends said that she and Douglas kept spending enough time together that they still came across like they were a couple, even though they were not. So Douglas certainly did not fit the profile of an embittered ex who would commit murder as vengeance over their breakup. Now, I know that sometimes murderers will arrange to be the ones who discover their victims' bodies in an attempt to make themselves look innocent, and Douglas was the person who showed up at Cassandra's residence and found her and her children dead. Douglas also attempted to collect on an insurance policy Cassandra had taken out, but it must be reiterated that investigators have never considered him to be a suspect, so they may have had good reason to rule him out. Douglas eventually moved to Oregon, and the Colorado Cold Case podcast was hoping to track him down for an interview, but they were unable to locate him. And that's too bad, because there are certain things about this case where I would like to hear Douglas provide some clarification. Remember, he claimed that he spoke to Cassandra on the phone on the evening of February the 13th, and believed she had a visitor at her house at the time, but the details are kind of murky. In the weeks following the murders, Douglas essentially went into seclusion and stopped talking to the media, but if you search the newspaper archives from late February of 1985, you'll find an Associated Press article featuring comments from a man named Dave Boardman. Boardman was one of Cassandra's neighbors, and Douglas used his phone to call the police after he discovered the bodies, but in this particular article, Boardman shared some secondhand information which he claimed he had heard from Douglas. I've seen differing accounts about Cassandra's whereabouts on the evening of February the 13th, as some sources say that Douglas took her out to dinner, while another article I read said that Cassandra went to a school function with her kids and returned home at around 8:30 p.m. According to the Colorado Cold Case podcast, Cassandra and Douglas went out to lunch together on the 13th, so maybe this is where the confusion stems from, and Cassandra still attended the school function during the evening. Whatever the case, it sounds like Douglas did phone Cassandra at her residence that night, and here is the exact quote provided by Dave Boardman. Quote, "He said she had someone there and she would try to get rid of him. It must have been late because she apparently picked someone up at a bar and brought him home. At least that's what he seemed to think." End quote. So the wording here is quite confusing because when Boardman says, quote, "she would try to get rid of him," does that mean that Cassandra wanted to get Douglas off the phone? Or did she tell him she was planning to get rid of her guest? Did Cassandra flat out tell Douglas there was someone at her house, or did he just assume that to be the case? Was it ever officially confirmed that Cassandra went out to a bar that night and picked someone up, or is that just speculation on Douglas's part? This is why I was interested in hearing a current interview with Douglas so he could clarify these points. The idea of Cassandra and her kids being murdered by someone she invited into her home would make sense because there were no signs of forced entry. However, investigators seem certain that the crime took place sometime between 7 and 8 a.m. on the morning of February the 14th. If Cassandra got rid of this guest and asked him to leave, did he return the following morning to commit murder? Or did he actually spend the night? If so, what could have driven him to murder a mother and her 2 children at that time? Since the beds were made, investigators were inclined to think that the murders did not take place until after everyone woke up. Unlike his mother and sister, Detrick was dressed in street clothes when his body was found, and one neighbor thought they saw him in front of the house at around 7 a.m., so he may have gone back inside while the other murders were taking place. Committing a crime like this at that time of the morning seems unusual, as you'd assume that an intruder would be inclined to break into the house in the middle of the night. We don't have any eyewitnesses from the neighborhood who reported seeing any strangers entering or leaving the residence, and Douglas's phone call is the only indication we have that Cassandra may have brought someone back there, or at the very least, they showed up at the front door that night and Cassandra invited them inside. Investigators have always been inclined to believe that the killer was someone the victims knew, and if he spent the night, I'm not sure if Cassandra would have allowed him to do so unless it was someone her kids felt comfortable with. It's still not clear if this crime was a planned, premeditated murder, or if something happened which just caused the perpetrator to snap, but the fact that the two female victims were both tied up and sexually assaulted makes me lean towards the former. We've got one convicted murderer who has popped up on the radar as a promising suspect, and that's Philip Wilkinson, and I personally think there are compelling points which lean both towards and away from him being the killer. I know that Cassandra's father, Richard Rundle, was convinced that Wilkinson committed the crime and believed that the Colorado Springs PD dismissed him as a suspect too easily. Wilkinson's current status as a suspect was one of the questions that the Colorado Cold Case podcast posed to the police, but they never provided a response, so it's unclear if he's officially been ruled out. It seems like investigators initially believed that Wilkinson was in South Korea, but since military records confirmed him arriving at Fort Carson a very short time before these murders took place, he technically would have been in the area and had the opportunity. I have to say that when I first read about the murders of the Hudson family in Fayetteville in 1991, I felt there were too many similarities to this crime to be a coincidence. We have a mother, daughter, and a son who were all savagely murdered inside their residence, with the two females being sexually assaulted and the victims being bludgeoned with a blunt instrument. In both cases, the killer used an item that they found at the scene rather than something they brought with them, as Detrick Sturm's own hockey stick was used to beat his mother and sister, while Wilkinson used a bowling pin he found in the yard to bludgeon the Hudsons. During his confession, Wilkinson also admitted that he was a peeping Tom and that his habit had first started when he was stationed at Fort Carson in 1985. From what I can tell, the Hudsons were completely selected at random because Wilkinson happened to see the daughter Crystal sleeping on a couch through some sliding glass doors, and he decided he wanted to break in. Could a similar situation have happened in Colorado Springs, where Wilkinson was spying on Cassandra or possibly even Melanie at the residence and felt compelled to attack them? It does seem like a pretty plausible scenario, but here are some issues I have with Wilkinson being responsible for this crime. For starters, the only reason the Hudson murders were even solved was because Wilkinson said he'd become so overwhelmed with guilt that he decided to surrender himself to the police and make a full confession. Before that, I don't see any indication that Wilkinson was on the radar as a possible suspect, and while forensic advances might have led to him being caught eventually, he pretty much paved the way for his own arrest. So if he was that guilt-ridden over what he did to the Hudsons, and had also been responsible for murdering Cassandra and her two children, why would he have confessed to that crime as well? Now obviously, I'm not going to take Wilkinson's non-confession as conclusive evidence that he didn't do it, because convicted murderers are notorious for manipulating people once they've got nothing left to lose, as they will often confess to crimes they didn't commit or refuse to admit their culpability in other crimes they did commit, even though there's no chance they're ever going to get out of prison. However, Wilkinson's situation is a bit unique because when he was sentenced to death for murdering the Hudsons, he seemed genuinely remorseful for his actions and content to expedite his execution and get it over with, so you can't say he refused to admit culpability for those murders because he was fearful. Indeed, Wilkinson was scheduled to be executed only 2.5 years after he was originally sentenced, which is a pretty quick turnaround time for death penalty cases, and it was only after he threatened to kill himself that Wilkinson did a 180 and decided he did not want to die after all. But during that 5-year window between when Wilkinson turned himself in and he was granted a stay of execution, he did come across like a man who wanted to pay for his crimes, so it is surprising that he wouldn't have admitted any involvement in the Colorado Springs murders if he was guilty. Another detail which might go against Wilkinson being the perpetrator is his age, as he was only 17 years old in February of 1985. I was actually surprised that someone that young would be in the Army to begin with, but 17-year-olds can still enlist in the military if they have parental consent, which I'm guessing must have happened here. Of course, 17-year-olds are also capable of committing horrific murders, but what are the odds that Cassandra would pick someone up that young and invite him back to her residence? According to her friends, Cassandra, who was 37 at the time, preferred to date within her own age bracket, and it would have been out of character for her to become involved with someone who was 20 years younger. I mean, anything's possible, but would Cassandra have been comfortable dating a man who was only 5 years older than her own son? Another interesting point I've seen in online discussions about this case is that the state of Colorado had strict liquor licensing regulations which required all bar patrons to be at least 21 years of age or older. If Douglas Meltzer is correct in his assumption that Cassandra brought home a man from a bar, then I doubt she would have met the 17-year-old Wilkinson there unless this particular bar was very lax about this sort of thing, or Wilkinson had a convincing fake ID. But again, we need more clarification on whether or not Cassandra met someone at a bar that night, as it's still unclear if she actually told Douglas that, or if he was just assuming that was the case. And all this speculation is completely irrelevant if Cassandra never actually invited her killer into the home, and Wilkinson actually broke in to commit the murders, much like he did in Fayetteville. Investigators have frequently expressed their belief that the victims knew their killer, but since Wilkinson had only been stationed at Fort Carson for a few weeks, if not days, Cassandra and her children would not have had much opportunity to get to know him. It's also worth mentioning that when Wilkinson was stationed at Fort Bragg when he murdered the Hudsons, he went AWOL and pretty much disappeared the very next day. Yet there's no indication that anything like this happened at Fort Carson, even though Wilkinson would have been much younger and less mature. It seems weird that he could just go on living a normal life for the next 6 years, and then suddenly develop a guilty conscience after he murdered another family. Even though law enforcement has been very secretive about their stance on Wilkinson as a suspect, I would like to think they've done their due diligence when it comes to comparing his DNA to evidence from the murder scene. So for all we know, perhaps they discovered there was no match, and Wilkinson had been cleared as a suspect. I find it interesting that in the year following the crime, long before Wilkinson was even on the radar, a grand jury was convened, and while they determined there was not enough evidence to charge anyone, you have to wonder if law enforcement had any specific suspects in mind when they did this. And I hearken back to this quote from retired detective Dick Reisler about an unnamed potential suspect. Quote, "If I were on the jury with the suspect in mind, I wouldn't convict him either." I think that perfectly summarizes this case, as it sounds like a number of people have their own hunches and gut feelings about who they believe the perpetrator could be, but nothing conclusive. However, the one piece of evidence which is conclusive is DNA, so I can only hope that investigators are still working behind the scenes to do everything they can to link this DNA to a suspect. It was only about 1 year ago when I heard the announcements about the arrests in the Orange Sock murders and the Roger Dean case, and at the time, I had no idea that law enforcement was even actively investigating these crimes. So maybe sometime later this year, or in the near future, we'll suddenly hear some news about a suspect being arrested for this crime. All that being said, if forensic science doesn't lead anywhere, then perhaps the one thing which could break this case wide open is if someone comes forward. So if you happen to have any information on the murders of Cassandra Rundle, Detrick Sturm, and Melanie Sturm, please contact the Colorado Springs Police Department at 719-444-7000. That's 719-444-7000. Or you can also submit a tip through the website for the Pikes Peak Area Crime Stoppers, or call them at 1-800-222-TIPS. That's 1-800-222-8477. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. This past month, I actually recorded a special bonus episode with Charlie, the host of the Crime Lines podcast, in which we discussed a bizarre missing children's case from Spain about the disappearance of 10-year-old Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez. In addition, we've dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discuss another classic case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1987 disappearance of Dale Kerstetter. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. And yes, the most recent episode I've done a commentary for is the infamous one about African fertility statues. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Bill H., Monica W., Lolly, John G., and Mandy O. Thank you all so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I'd like to play a promo for another true crime podcast, Dealing Justice.
911, what's the nature of your emergency?
Your world can change in the blink of an eye.
He walked into the bedroom and you know that she had been murdered.
So he's running up and down, screaming, "Oh my God, someone call 911. There are two men killing a girl."
I know my son, and he would not go that long without saying anything to anyone.
Safety can be an illusion and reality a nightmare.
So how do you steal a person, a grown person?
Unspeakable crimes can penetrate any small town, big family, pretty face, or innocent child. And in the wake of a loved one's murder or disappearance, there is nothing more cruel or desperate as silence.
Why won't people talk about it? That's another thing. People don't want to talk about it around here.
For the families of the missing and murdered, they gambled with their sanity as they lose hope in closure and settle for justice. That's where the cold case playing cards come in. In each episode of the Dealing Justice podcast, your hosts Jennifer Dubisak and Lori Jennings will spotlight one card from the cold case playing card deck. Hear the victim's story from the friends and family who knew them best.
Her mom will never stop fighting until she finds out what happens to her daughter.
Learn about the crime and help close the case. Welcome to Season 2. We're not just playing cards, we're dealing justice.
I'm also pleased to announce that The Trail Went Cold has been added to the lineup for Podcast Row at 2 CrimeCon events this year. So provided that it is safe enough to travel, I'll be appearing at CrimeCon 2022, which is being held at Paris and Bally's in Las Vegas from April the 29th until May the 1st. If you would like to purchase tickets, we already have our own personalized promo code to receive a 10% discount off a standard batch. Please visit crimecon.com and enter the promo code TRAIL. I'm also hoping to appear at CrimeCon UK, being held at the Leonardo Royal Hotel and Spa in London on June the 11th and the 12th. If you would like to get a 10% discount on tickets to this event, please visit crimecon.co.uk and use the promo code COLD22. In addition, I wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. Anyway, next Wednesday, February the 16th, is going to be a very special one, as we are officially going to be celebrating our 6-year anniversary of this podcast. I've decided to commemorate the occasion by covering one of my all-time passion cases, and it's going to be such an in-depth exploration that it's going to be a 2-part episode, which will be released on the 16th and February the 23rd. And yes, I'm going to be covering the 1962 escape from Alcatraz. So until then, have yourself a good week, and join us next Wednesday for part 1 of our special anniversary episode of The Trail Went Cold.